you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
Welcome to Mindshock True Crime. You are listening to the Springfield 3 series. This is, of course, focusing on the 3 missing women from Springfield, Missouri. The unsolved cold case of friends Suzanne Susie Streeter and Stacy McCall and Streeter's mother, Cheryl Levitt, who went missing from Levitt's home in Springfield, Missouri, June 7, 1992. Their belongings, including cars and purses, were left behind. So they've been missing for 27 years. Over 27 years. Coming on 28 years. So in this episode, the investigation. In this episode, we will examine the police investigation, what can be gleaned from the police report, and how that investigation has progressed over the years, what the police have made public, not made public, and many leads that were probably not followed. From all accounts, it seems there were unfollowed leads. Some of them quite mind-shocking. As always, if you like the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. Make sure you allow your device to have those notifications come through. If you like the podcast, hit the like button and share it across social media platforms. Some of these old-time cold cases need to be kept in the public eye in order to break the case. Regardless of what happened, obviously, families need closure, and anything that keeps the awareness up can possibly get someone to remember something or someone to talk. Any questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings, leave them in the comment section. You could also check us out on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get top priority for case topic requests, as well as co-podcaster requests. All right, so let's jump right in here. Let's look at the exact police report. This was a missing persons report. The people listed here: Janice McCall, Janelle Kirby, Mike Henson. Officer Galt and myself responded to 1717 East Delmar, where we were contacted by Mrs. McCall. Mrs. McCall stated her daughter, Stacy Kathleen McCall, was to spend the night at this location with her girlfriend, Suzanne Streeter. Suzanne lives at this address with her mother, Cheryl Levitt. Mrs. McCall stated 2 of Stacy and Suzanne's friends, Mr. Henson and Miss Kirby, who were also present, contacted her when they were unable to locate Stacy, Suzanne, and Mrs. Levitt. Miss Kirby and Mr. Henson told me they last saw Suzanne and Stacy at a graduation party at Coach Drive in Battlefield around 0200 hours this morning. Kirby stated she, Henson, and Stacy and Suzanne left the party at this residence at Coach Drive and went to her house. This is Janelle Kirby's house on Butterfield Place, which is just around the corner from the Coach Drive residence. Kirby and Henson stated Stacy and Suzanne told them they were going to go to Suzanne's house to spend the night and for them to call Suzanne's house later in the morning, and they were all to go to Whitewater. Kirby and Henson stated Stacy and Suzanne then left, each driving their own vehicle. Miss Kirby stated she called Suzanne's house several times starting around 7:30 in the morning. She stated she kept getting the answering machine. Kirby said she and Henson went to Suzanne's around 12:30 and found Stacy's vehicle as well as Suzanne's car in the driveway. Mrs. Levitt's vehicle was in the carport. Kirby and Henson state they found the front porch light globe broken on the front steps and the front porch light on. So again, we went over this in previous episodes. The light bulb itself was not broken. The globe around it was what was broken. Okay. They stated the front door was closed but unlocked. After knocking and ringing the bell several times, Kirby and Henson state they announced themselves and went on in. They found the TV set in Suzanne's bedroom on. All 3 of the women's purses were in Suzanne's room. Okay, that room is located in the northeast corner of the house. Kirby and Henson stated they left and then returned at 7:30 p.m. after calling several times and found everything to be the same. Mrs. McCall stated she and her husband arrived around 2100 hours, about 9 p.m. Okay, upon arriving, Officer Galt and myself found several people at the residence. These being Kirby, Henson, Mr. and Mrs. McCall, Mrs. McCall's daughter, another friend of Stacy and Suzanne's, and her mother, and Miss Kirby's parents. Okay. Of course, there were many, many people in this unsecured location. Okay. Upon attempting to conduct an investigation of the house, Officer Galt and I were advised by the subjects present that they had already cleaned up the glass and looked around the residence prior to our arrival. Officer Galt and I did find all the vehicles there and all their purses in the bedroom, the house keys, and keys to the vehicles were also there. Mrs. McCall advised that the handwriting on this police report is really terrible. It's hard to read. This is a handwritten report by the officers. Mrs. McCall advised that Stacy's swimsuit she was going to take to Whitewater was in Suzanne's room, as well as the clothes she had been wearing. Officer Galt advised he found jewelry, which, according to Mrs. McCall, Stacy had been wearing in the pocket of the shorts Stacy had worn. Nothing in the house seemed to indicate a struggle. Although Mrs. McCall stated Stacy would never go anywhere without her purse, makeup, and medication she takes for migraines, headaches, and depression. The whereabouts of Suzanne's mother, Mrs. Levitt, is also unknown. Mrs. McCall stated she saw Mrs. Levitt at the graduation ceremony at the Student Center the previous day at 1815 hours. So roughly after 6 p.m., shortly after 6 p.m. She thought Mrs. Levitt was at New Attitudes. So that is the hair salon she worked at. Officer Galt attempted to contact neighbors, which is the first house west of the residence, but found no one home. He made contact with neighbors at other addresses who stated they had been home but had not noticed anything out of the ordinary at this address. So that's an interesting point, because this would have all had to have been done silently depending on how far the neighbors were. So there was no screaming or anything like that. All of these variables in this case, of course, very, very bizarre and puzzling. Okay, I checked with our department. Chicken Scratch says calls Chicken Scratch at the address or in the Chicken Scratch the past 24 hours and found nothing close. Okay, so calls for some kind of service at this address. So I guess in the past 24 hours, I guess he's checking 911 calls or something like that. Also, the Missouri State Highway Patrol and the Greene County Sheriff's Office were contacted, but they had not had any contact with the 3 subjects. Mrs. McCall called local hospitals, but they had not seen them. Officer Galt and I found house keys, at which time, after contacting missing persons reports, we asked Chicken Scratch. They left a note to contact the police department. Okay. the keys were logged into property. All right, so very sloppy handwriting from whoever wrote this report. Really terrible, very, very difficult to make out. Definitely need to learn how to write legible police reports, especially for future reference. All right, so what's interesting regarding the report, of course, a couple points there on what was found, and of course the contaminated crime scene, all these things, and the neighbors had not seen anything out of the ordinary, and some of the neighbors were not home at the time. Okay, so they didn't mention the calls on the answering machine, the voicemails, or that Janelle had picked up the phone to these supposed crank calls or whatnot, and the deleted voicemails. So, interesting points there. So, I'm going to go over some musings, again, by many different astute online researchers. So, in some cases, police get criticized for not revealing enough, but this was actually one of the cases where they were criticized for revealing a lot. But a lot of what? A lot of things that don't matter, and then didn't reveal things that did, that could potentially lead to solving of the case. So in the previous episode, make sure you check it out, Suspect City. There is no shortage of suspects in this case. And there's the Galloping Goose Motorcycle Club, a motorcycle gang involved in drug trafficking. There are some theories that there's involvement with the police in that matter. Then we have CI possibilities. There's a lot of crisscrossing there. Previous cases. Yes, it's very unknown the level of complicity by certain corrupt officers, if any, that could have jeopardized this investigation. But this is a post on Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, Springfield 3, What Haven't Police Revealed? On a midsummer morning in 1992, a high school couple pay a visit to a friend and open the door to an enduring mystery that continues to this day. This particular poster believes the trio were abducted and murdered. Rather than go over the rogues gallery of likely and ancillary suspects, I want to ask this. What pertinent information has been squirreled away in police files and evidence vaults for 27 years? This was posted last year. Robin Warder's terrific podcast series, The Trail Went Cold, recently devoted an episode to this case. I found it broke down the case in a particularly sharp and clear way and left me wondering about 3 specific areas Warder detailed. None of these are answered satisfactorily. All involve some level of police silence. My point here is not to suggest conspiracy. I just want to know if these are indeed unresolved questions, if there is more known about them to case experts, and if not, why police haven't shared more about them after so much time has gone by. 1. The mysterious telephone calls to the Levitt home. While Janelle Kirby and her boyfriend searched the Levitt home, the phone rang twice. Both times, Janelle picked it up and reported that an unknown male caller had made sexual innuendos before she hung up on him. Later on, another call was made to the Levitt house, leaving a message. That afternoon, McCall's mother, Janice, searching for her daughter in the house, saw there was a message and played the message. She said it was a, quote, strange message, end quote, but nothing else. By playing the message, she inadvertently erased it, as answering machines often self-deleted after playing. Did they really? I mean, I've never had an answering machine in the past that's self-deleted after playing, because of course if it's an important message, you might need to play it back if they had certain details or addresses or really important work-related information. I mean, depending on what kind of an answering machine, if it was, I don't know. It seems strange. Now, in a case where there's so many other strange oddities, this is simply yet another one. Some people believe that there was something on that voicemail that could have had some clues. So, yeah. Here's the question, what do police know about these messages that they aren't telling? They have said that the first 2 calls were not connected to the third. How do they know this? And that's an excellent question that I've asked before about certain police statements on how they know it's XYZ instead of ABC or whatnot, because they don't reveal it. So they do seem to obviously have information they have not revealed. Okay. They also said that the first 2 calls were unconnected with the disappearance. So they're saying the first 2 calls not connected to the third, and the first 2 not connected to the disappearance. So what about the third? I believe this, but want to know how the police ruled it out. Did they check phone records and trace the calls to their source? Did they find out why they were made? If it was a prank call and they didn't want to bring undue publicity to someone, why not just say so rather than leave it hanging? And another important thing to note in a lot of these investigations, police do certain things on purpose because they either want to draw out a suspect or they believe they have a suspect, but that suspect didn't act alone and they need more information. So they do have certain strategies. Is this part of it? Obviously, we don't know. Okay, and what about the third call? Could Janice really have forgotten the message? Distraught as she was, her mind must have been like a sponge in those frantic hours grasping at anything. Yet she claims she can't remember. Police have said the call may be connected to the case and even that it, quote, may have contained a clue, end quote. Given what little we have from Janice on the matter, this seems like guesswork unless there is more to it that hasn't been said. Warder suggested that she might have recalled more about the call, but the police requested she not make it public. I think this makes sense, but keeping it a secret this long does not. And that's another good point, because the longer some of these cold cases drag on, the less likely they are to be solved. Is it time to really show all the cards, put all the cards on the table, and just have a last-ditch attempt at any kind of closure in solving the case, because it hasn't been solved so far. Whatever strategies the police have employed have not worked thus far. Okay, 2, clearing the grave robbers. One set of initial suspects, which included a former boyfriend of Susie's, she was preparing to testify against after he was arrested for robbing graves, or vandalizing crypts, if you want to be more accurate, was cleared by the Springfield police chief for reasons that were not detailed and apparently left others in the department angry at having been bigfooted by their boss. I don't think the grave robbers did it either. Like Warder says in the podcast, murdering 3 people is kind of overreach to silence a witness's testimony about a lesser crime. Okay, I will give a caveat there. I agree with that as well. However, if you just want to send a message and you want to slap people around, things can get out of hand and crimes are committed in the heat of moments. So I agree that these petty crypt vandals would probably not hatch this plan to kill people unless, if they were on drugs. There's a lot of different variables here. If they were forced to do it by the Galloping Goose connections, again, make sure you listen to the previous podcast to get all the available details known on this case. There's other moving pieces here. It's not so simple as, yes, crypt vandals acting alone, not under the influence, would probably not risk murdering 3 people in a neighborhood with neighbors around. Probably not. However, if they wanted to scare them, possibly a little bit of light assault, slapping them around, things got out of hand and they unintentionally either hit one too hard, something went out of hand, they might have accidentally killed one of them, or thought they killed them even if they didn't, just knocked them unconscious, and then things got really out of hand and they panicked. And then could the crime have occurred that way? Again, there's a lot of possibilities here. I don't want to fall for logical fallacies. This is Mindshock. The only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. All right. Also, the abduction seems to have been carried out with dispatch and surgical precision. 2 elements not at all evident in the antics of this crew of drug-addled grave robbers who got caught when Susie's ex tried to pawn off a gold tooth. So again, I agree, if they were involved, they most likely were not acting alone. But if the chief was satisfied they were innocent, where's the explanation for it? They have motive and opportunity and deserve to be accounted for in the public record. Number 3, the Garrison connection. And I've spent quite some time on Stephen Eugene Garrison in the previous podcasts. If you haven't checked those out, again, make sure you check them out. In August 93, Stephen Eugene Garrison was arrested on an unrelated weapons charge. During his plea bargaining, Garrison said he had information as to what had happened to the Springfield Three, namely that a drunken friend had confessed to murdering them. Warder notes that Garrison, quote, revealed a piece of info that had not been revealed publicly and showed there might be some truth to his claims, end quote. After initially fleeing police and committing a sexual assault while on the run, Garrison led police to a farm where he claimed the trio were buried. The bodies weren't found, of course, but Warder notes that other items were found. What were they, and how, if at all, did they relate to the Springfield Three? It was never disclosed, as Warder notes a judge issued a gag order preventing police from saying more. Again, I went over this in the previous podcast. Why is that gag order still in effect? The owner of the property died in 1995. If the items found did connect to the Springfield Three, why not say so and how? And if they didn't, why not say so? These are just the questions I was left with after listening to 20 minutes of Warder's podcast. There are more questions he looks into as well, very worth your while. Here's the thing, a lot of talk about the Springfield Three centers around a broken porch-like globe, a parking lot identified by a psychic as the burial site of the three victims, a green van, and a bitter brother, all of which seem dead ends at best. Could other info exist that could shed new light on the fate of Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy? Listening to The Trail Went Cold, I kept thinking that the trail here might not be so cold if police had been more forthcoming about what they know. And again, some of this could suggest there's some kind of police conspiracy, and I am going to delve into that possibility as well. Okay, the first response to this post was this. What is interesting to note is that detectives in most cases are often criticized for revealing too little information. But in this case, it was the opposite. Police Chief Terry Knowles, who led the original investigation, was criticized by his own detectives for giving too much information to the media, including virtually every detail of how the Levitt home looked on June 7th, 1992. The authorities gave out so much information that one detective said that even if they had a suspect, they wouldn't be able to validate their confession because every single detail they would normally hold back had been released to the public. Although I would add this, because if the police, there were so many people that were coming and going, over a dozen, if not close to 24 or more, people that came and went, nobody would really know what the scene looked like immediately after the abduction because the scene was so contaminated. So you could say that it was almost irrelevant on what it looked like at that moment because it could have looked different at the time of the abduction. So whether the purses were lined up in a row or not, it's just, unless you're taking on blind faith as gospel truth, that the first people that arrived didn't move anything, even though they admitted they did. And obviously, it's so problematic. But anyway, Knowles even allowed the media to film two suspects being polygraphed, a flagrant violation of department rules at the time, and let reporters publish photographs of Susie's bedroom. Knowles had also been described as a micromanager who did not allow detectives to pursue leads as they normally would and turned down assistance. For example, I believe the state police offered him some computers to help better organize the large amount of tips leads they were receiving, but Knowles refused, leaving them to use the more cumbersome system of index cards. Detectives have also complained that they were discouraged from sharing leads with each other for some inexplicable reason and criticized Knowles for prematurely ruling out suspects who may have had a motive to kill one or more of the missing women. This has nothing to do with the three specific things you posted, but it's interesting and possibly relevant stuff. And this is why some people point to either some kind of police complicity and some conspiracy, because it sure looks like Knowles is trying to bungle the investigation. Or this is a Keystone Cops situation, where Knowles is just that incompetent or ego-driven. He doesn't want to accept assistance. He wants things done a particular way, and he thinks it might make him look bad. Or so whether he's intentionally or unintentionally bungling the investigation, there does seem to have been a lot of roadblocks intentionally put in place by Knowles. Now, whether that was nefarious or not, that we don't know. So other people pointed out this. I've had a lot of new thoughts about this case since hearing the podcast as well. It's just so hard for me to believe that it was a total stranger abduction. All three women's vehicles were parked outside the home. What single intruder chooses a home that looks so full? Even if a man followed the girls home, why wouldn't he be concerned about possible males in the house with a car already there. And they hadn't lived there terribly long, so I assume you'd really have to be watching them to know it's two women living alone. And again, if you listen to the previous episode, there were suspects who supposedly worked for a utility company that may have worked on that street and have had a lot of time and access to watch the house. But anyway, this case is so sad and mind-boggling. I also don't know a terrier that doesn't lose its mind around people, strangers. I hate to even say it, but hurting Cinnamon would accomplish two things. Prove to the women you're serious and they need to come with you, and shutting up the yapping. Someone familiar with Cinnamon and the girls would maybe be less likely to hurt her. The front door was unlocked. Did the girls forget to lock it behind them? Did the abductor have a key or know that it opened the door for them? This is definitely one of those cases it's easy to go wild with speculation. And that's a good point on Cinnamon and the dog. If you're again, even cold-blooded serial killers, some of them do like animals and won't harm animals, but they will harm humans. I mean, there's so many different possible dynamics here. But even in that case, the dog probably would have went crazy if it was a random abduction with scary-looking strangers. However, if it was someone known to Cinnamon or a friend of the girls, especially if they had been there before, possibly might not. Or if even in that situation, Susie Streeter or her mother Cheryl might have quieted or calmed down Cinnamon if it was someone they trusted, even though if that trust was misplaced. A follow-up comment to that one was, this is what makes me think it was someone they knew, and this person was possibly already in the house by the time the girls arrived. Someone who is not obviously a threat at first because they took time to take their makeup off and get ready for bed. So maybe a friend of Cheryl's or a neighbor. I remember reading somewhere, I can't remember where I heard this, I've done so much reading on this case, that Janelle or a friend noticed that Susie's car was not parked in its usual spot, even though that spot was free. This makes me think by the time her and Stacy arrived at the house, there was another car taking up her spot. Okay, here is speculation on what the police know about the calls. There is a good chance, really good chance, the cops conducted interviews and gleaned details from both individuals who either received calls or heard messages. From there, the cops would have had cursory knowledge of what the calls consisted of and would have been able to loosely determine if the calls were related. Additionally, from the interviews, that they may have determined that some of the gathered information would have been useful as a means to vet future potential witnesses or tips, and then made the determination to withhold certain aspects of it from the public domain. Regarding tracing calls, this was 1992. Cellular communications, while existent, were nowhere near the norm. Police would have a difficult time retroactively tracing calls. Furthermore, if calls were made from a phone booth, then good luck identifying who made a call. Cameras were not as prevalent as they are now, so footage of people coming and going or using the booth to make the call would depend on a witness, and if that phone was located miles away in another town, good luck having a potential witness make a connection that the guy using the booth in the morning is doing anything shady. So other people chimed in regarding that post. The difficulty in tracing calls would have depended on whether time was a factor or not. Real-time tracing would have been hit or miss, but pretty much all exchanges but the very most rural were computerized for billing purposes by 1992. The originating exchange, originating number, and call duration would have been in the phone bill. It would have been easier to get the information collated on the bill than at the instance of the call. There would be no information available on the content of the call, but the existence of the call and billing info, like whether it was local or long distance, or originated as a toll call or at a payphone or on a calling card, would be readily available to police. Okay, so another thing that regarding Robert Craig Cox that we keep going back to, he did say he would reveal the truth when his mother died. So as of a year or so, when Warner did his podcast, Cox's mother was still alive. All right, another interesting response here is I've got a theory as to the general nature of this unrevealed evidence. Emphasis on general nature. One thing that utterly baffles me about this case is the naivete of the people who were in the house that morning and afternoon. The front door is unlocked. All 3 cars are in the driveway. The keys and purses lined up inside. Susie and Stacy are missing their long-awaited trip to the water park. Even Cinnamon is all agitated. And no one is alarmed. Several hours pass and almost 20 people go in and out of the house until Stacy's mother finally calls the police. Saying that it was an unusually trusting place and time doesn't make sense. Springfield is a city, not some peaceful rural village, and if anything, crime rates in 1992 were higher than they are today. My theory is that there was something in the house that offered an at least semi-plausible explanation for the 3's absence. For lack of a better idea, maybe a note purportedly written by one of them, an explanation which made sense at first but became less believable as time went on. Whatever the case, it's surprising that none of the people aware of this note or whatever have broken their silence. Now, that is a very, very interesting theory and definitely explains a lot more thus far. Because if Janelle Kirby and Mike Henson were not involved in the disappearance, or maybe even if they were, I don't know, all these other people coming and going, it does seem that if there was a reason that was semi-plausible or whatnot at the house, like a note, that would make sense why nobody panicked immediately. For example, if they said they were going to come back that night, or I don't know, something, possibly not even a note. That's an interesting point. That ties up the loose end of why so many people came and went without doing it. Like, it's strange. Some semi-plausible explanation that became less plausible as the day wore on, with no return, no phone call. Maybe they said they would call. I mean, who knows? Maybe it was even something nefarious, like if the kidnappers left something that said, if you contact the police, we'll kill them, or something like that. Anything. Something that kept immediate action from being taken, because it just doesn't really make a lot of sense. Another interesting post here. Some will say it isn't relevant to the case, but was Cinnamon locked in the bathroom when Janelle first arrived? I've heard reports say that she sprinted into Janelle's arms when she opened the front door, but others claim that the dog was left in the bathroom. Since she was known for being a yappy Yorkie, it would make sense that Susie or Cheryl would leave her in the bathroom before letting someone in the house. No sign of forced entry that we know. I also wish Larry Dwayne Hall was looked at in better detail. Of course, I went over him in the previous podcast, Suspect City. The colors of the green van varied from black, white, blue, and brown, according to witness reports and a nightly newspaper boy. Larry Hall abducted many of his victims in a brown van, but when he was also in Indianapolis on July 1st, 1991, where he most likely killed Michelle Dewey, 20, he stated his interest in a 1980 blue Dodge van he saw in a sales ad. Wilson's Creek National Battlefield is less than 2 miles from Janelle Kirby's house. Larry's brother Gary also claimed he owned the green van. Just playing devil's advocate, here at this point, does anyone have any information? Someone responded that Cinnamon was found running free in the house and not locked in the bathroom, which again begs the question, why are there so many alternate reports? Okay, regarding Cheryl's ex-boyfriend, which we didn't really talk about in detail, although there are some theories circulating about that. Another poster brought this point forward. I heard at the beginning Cheryl had an ex who was in a lot of debt and saddled her with it. Is it possible their disappearance has something to do with that? Someone came after her not expecting the girls to also be there. Cheryl had 2 exes. It was her second husband that put her in debt, then disappeared. She moved out of another house to cut expenses and pay the bills her ex left her with. But I don't know if there was anything outstanding, or if so, enough for the wrong guy to kill her over. And people were asked if both of these guys were cleared. In the Trail Went Cold podcast, they did mention that her first husband, Brent Streeter, was investigated and cleared after a period of police trying to track him down. The podcast goes on to say right after that neither he nor Don Levitt, Cheryl's ex number 2, were seen as serious suspects. Okay, here's another very good theory from another poster. The mom had been refinishing a chest inside the house at the time of the incident. I have helped refinish furniture, and I routinely work with a variety of similar chemicals in my hobbies. If you are doing this type of work indoors, you must open doors and windows, or you will pass out or become ill from toxins. That's why it is preferred that you refinish furniture in an open garage or outdoors. My theory is that the mom left windows open to air out the place while they went to the graduation ceremony. Whoever committed this act came in through a window, hid in a closet, and waited until after they had returned and fallen asleep. Once they were asleep, the criminal appeared. He used a gun and forced the women at gunpoint to bind one another and tape each other's mouths. The criminal then began carrying each woman one by one out to a van. While carrying one of the women out the front door, their foot or head hit the front porch light, shattering the shell casing on the light. It's also possible one of the women purposely kicked the light casing while being carried out. They had just recently moved into the neighborhood and probably caught the eye of someone who lived in that area, or caught someone's eye the day of the crime and they followed them back to the house. With the windows wide open, the criminal had just the right opportunity. This was a crime of opportunity. This wasn't a robbery. This was sexual and or about power. Whoever went in there knew there was no man in the house, so they may have been watching the house for a while and knew there would be no real assistance. My belief is that the crime was committed by one person. It is very easy for one person to control 3 women if a gun is involved. And it was around 3 a.m. in the morning or later, so no neighbors are going to be up at that time to witness the criminal moving people in and out of the house. Perfect timing. Well, keep in mind it was graduation night, though. So people were coming and going at early hours that particular night, not other nights. This poster goes on, my criminal profile, white male, age 30 to 50 at the time of the crime. It wasn't an older male, as the women would have felt more confident in fleeing or fighting. The person had to be strong enough to lift and carry the women, so the man probably had a muscular physique. No way an overweight person is carrying out this crime. Highly intelligent or above average at worst. Highly disciplined, may have military background. Wanted to isolate and overpower these women and take them away to another location where they would have more control, enjoy, and take pleasure in controlling them. Whoever did this did not want the bodies found, which leads me to believe that it wasn't someone like the BTK killer, who was active at this time and lived only 4 hours away, who got off on leaving puzzles and evidence at the scene. This person was meticulous, precise, and either planned this out for weeks or planned it out in their head while waiting inside for the women to return. They could have scoped out the inside of the house while the women were away so they could best formulate their attack. They may have taken trinkets or mementos to keep. Everyone who lived in the nearby neighborhood should be investigated and called into question. Any businesses nearby at the time should have the employees investigated. It doesn't matter how church-going, nice, friendly, or decent they think someone might be. It doesn't matter if the person is a police officer, mailman, or high-ranking member of a church. Everyone should be investigated. It 100% wasn't the grave robbing teens. They could never have pulled this off, nor could they have kept their mouths shut this long. Most of them went on to become alcoholics and potheads, and they surely would have slipped up at some point. Well, nothing's 100%. I don't know. Again, I do think it's probably unlikely that it was the grave robbers or the crypt vandals acting alone. They were associated with some shady individuals. The Galloping Goose Motorcycle Club, which, again, yeah, this is not simple. If there weren't those connections, you could more easily rule them out, but unfortunately there are, and there's a lot of loose ends in this case. So another point about the crypt vandals, a poster wrote this: I lived in Kimberling City when this took place, not far from Springfield, about an hour, and knew some people. It's not too hard to follow what probably happened. Susie Streeter was appearing in court and had threatened some people for whatever reason. That was the talk. The Cox parking garage isn't where they ended up. The Ozarks have plenty of hollows and plenty of outlaws. Law enforcement never wanted to find out what happened. They'd just as soon leave well enough alone, and that's what they done. That's an interesting take, something that I haven't tackled yet. Did they just not want to mess with certain individuals that they thought were involved? And why is that? I'll be examining police conspiracy as well, but that's just a very creepy way of putting it. All right, Let's get ready for a mind-shocking lead up next. So hold on to your hats, all the listeners out there. This one is very, very mind-shocking. This was posted 4 years ago. Below is a conversation I had this week in the comment section of YouTube while watching Disappeared, the Springfield Three. Just seems odd to me that the authorities never seem to be interested in checking into this report as far as I can tell. FYI, consider this paraphrased. I have adjusted grammar and punctuation included in this witness's testimony originally posted on YouTube. I did this solely in an effort to convey the message I deemed to be intended by the original poster more concisely and coherently. So this is from the witness. I saw two of the girls in a van on Highway 101 going south. I stopped at a post office in Gamaliel, Arkansas, and used their phone to report the incident I saw in the van to Highway Patrol. The girl they called Stacy tried to jump from the van at 50 miles per hour. I did not know at the time anyone was missing, but I knew this girl wanted out of the van, so I took down the license plate. We stayed behind them even though they slowed down to about 5 miles per hour. I started taking mental notes of people in the van. There was the guy who pulled her back in the van by her arm and slapped her around. He had no shirt on and he had a ripped six-pack body. He laid down on something by the back window. There were 2 windows in the back of the van so I could see in well. He was blonde with long curly hair, tan, had a tattoo on the right arm like an eagle. The driver I could see only part of his head and he had dark brown hair, very short, and he was a big guy by the look of his shoulders. A small, pale, short blonde girl was in the passenger seat. Only saw a little of her. I found it strange that when the guy was striking the long, dark-haired girl, neither the driver nor passenger turned to look or help her. The only clothes the long-haired girl had on was a checkered flannel shirt. Yes, I have called many times to report this. The brother looks like the guy in the van, but a younger version. The van had an Alabama tag on it. They went down a gravel road off Highway 101. I think the road they went down was 245 or 145. I can't remember. My kids were with me and a boyfriend. So someone asked this witness, do you still have the license plate number? What have the cops said when you reported it? The response was this: no, sorry, I regret not saving it, but I know it was an Alabama tag, a Chevy van, and was 2 different colors, beige and burgundy. It might have been a burgundy stripe. The police can check this out by looking at phone records to Arkansas Highway Patrol that came from Gamaliel, Arkansas, from the Gamaliel, Arkansas U.S. Post Office. That is where I called to report it. An elderly lady worked there and let me use the phone. This was the first place I could get to a phone. I gave them the plate number, told them what happened, and told them which way they went. They have the plate number for that van. I can't remember the date, but it was in June or July of the year the girls went missing. They can check it out. My daughter remembers it happening. I have tried to remember as much as I can about it. I wish I could help more. I am sure it was Stacy who tried to jump. Her hair was not brushed. I will tell you everything I can remember. The only clothing she had on was a man's flannel shirt, dark-colored, checkered. The guy didn't have a shirt on. She didn't have shoes on when her leg came outside the door and he pulled her back in and was hitting her. He made her go to the back of the van with him, and what I found strange is he laid down on something just below the window. She kept her head down and her hands were placed on his back. She just stood there like that. Hope this helps. Okay, it's a very, very disturbing account. The other thing that's strange is why have one of them in the passenger seat in the front where someone could see them if they were driving, because they could scream or wave for help from the front passenger seat. I don't know. Okay, so if that was Susie in the front, Stacy in the back. Okay, another response here. The cops never said anything, but I felt like they did not believe me. Something was said about too many different kinds of vans being reported, and there was not a van. I just told them, and they might be able to solve it if they would check out the records. How hard is it to find the phone records of Highway Patrol in Arkansas in June and July of the year the girls went missing, and look for the U.S. Post Office in Gamaliel, Arkansas? Then look at what was reported on the call I made. They have the tag number on this van. It was an Alabama tag. Why do they not check it out? So, some commenters on this report, if we take this as credible, which is a definite if, some thoughts. No mention of Cheryl being present is odd. What scenario would have led to there being only Susie and Stacy? Some of the visual details seem too specific, like making out an eagle tattoo for the distance cars would have at highway speed. What if it wasn't an eagle? What if it was a galloping goose? I don't really understand what she's describing in regards to the man in the back laid down on something, nor the position she's describing Stacy in. The description of the two perps as big, buff, shirtless, eagle tattoos, long hair, practically scream, biker gang. Again, was this related to the Galloping Goose Motorcycle Club? Stacy wearing only a shirt is consistent with her shorts being found at the house. Do any of the known suspects have any ties to Alabama or Arkansas? From the list, I recall there was Robert Cox from Florida, the Civil War reenactment brothers, the guy who owns some sort of land outside town but within Missouri, Susie's ex-boyfriend from Springfield. Okay. First, I agree that this credibility of the story is iffy, and if you bring up some valid questions. Obviously, I can only guess, but she may have been tied up or even dead and lying on the floor of the van and therefore below the line of sight through the rear windows, regarding to where Cheryl is. She did say they slowed down to around 5 miles per hour at one point, so she was able to get a good look at them. Okay. The description of the perps also fits many people in rural Arkansas. I live in Fayetteville, Arkansas, which is very nice, but much of Arkansas is reminiscent of the movie Deliverance. Shirtless, tattooed, long-haired dudes are a dime a dozen in the area in question. All right, so here, let's move on to 2012, where law enforcement, Springfield Police Department issued this statement. The kidnapper clearly spent a considerable amount of time out and about from late at night on Saturday, June 6, 1992, into the morning of Sunday, June 7, 1992. The kidnapper had to have been unaccounted for at the time of the crime. Someone who knew or lived with the kidnapper in 1992 likely would have been aware of this fact. In addition, in order to explain his whereabouts on the night of the crime, the kidnapper may have fabricated a story regarding his activities. Around the time of the crime, the kidnapper may have spent a considerable amount of time in or may otherwise have been familiar with the area of the crime, and he may have frequently been out and about at odd hours. The kidnapper also may have developed an interest in the victims. People who know the kidnapper may not believe he is capable of committing this type of crime, and he may not have a history of committing crimes of violence. So this is the Springfield Police Department 2012 statement. So a couple issues here regarding the timeline. So Worsham and Glenn nailed down the timelines. The issue is how it was reported more than anything else. The partygoers, both Joy and elder party attendees, were all polygraphed or interviewed. Even many people at the concert that Mike and Dusty of the Crypt Vandals attended, which was the Cyanide Rainbow concert / show, were interviewed. One of the interviews is in the 48 Hours video. Some more musings here regarding Garrison, who threatened the attorney of the defendant was threatened. This is certainly something that is not done very often. I just can't find anything or anyone who believes the rapist had anything to do with it. And he puts no stock into the idea the other of the two grand jury 3 did either. One is in the slammer, the other is last known to be on the street. The convicted rapist has come up many times as a suspect. He, Robert Cox, and Gerald Carnahan are the 3 main suspects as far as I know. I have had so many discussions with one of the grave robbers This is an internet sleuth. It would fill volumes. I've seen his explanation, checked everything out, and there isn't anything I can see that would tie them to the actual crime. However, I do believe it was the fear out of some out in the Rogersville, Websters County area that believed Susie's upcoming testimony had something that might leak out in this court testimony. That, in my opinion, is where the most intriguing activities were taking place. I would look there. The future and former governor had the sheriff thrown out of office and his law enforcement credentials revoked. In effect, he was only an administrative sheriff. That, I believe, is the only time in Missouri history that has ever occurred. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that this goes pretty high up on the food chain. Very high if what I have seen and heard is true. But in the end, the only scenario that I can see that would work using just one person in one car would be a cop in a cop car. Everything else just falls apart, and that is what I believe. Although, a quick counterpoint there, wouldn't neighbors have noticed the cop car? I mean, even without the lights? I mean, I don't know. Strange. Okay. I will unquestionably get pushback on this, but I will say, in my opinion, that there are three viable suspects. None of the usual suspects were involved. Not the kids, not the grave robbers / crypt vandals, and not the grand jury 3. So this is just a post off an old forum regarding researchers in this case who have been involved in the investigation, or at least interviewing people involved in the investigation. It has long been rumored that the police were skimming off the drug stops along the I-44 corridor. Drugs were, I understand it, at least some of them, stored in the property room, and some cops could have been skimming and reselling for extra money as they were not well paid and allowed to work off-duty jobs to supplement their police pay. That is a rumor, and I got the clear impression from Garrison when he called me at home was that he was leaning in that direction. He also told me something else interesting. He didn't know who the biker was that threatened his attorney. Garrison, I believe, is a full patched Galloping Goose member. I guess patched is similar to being a made man in the Italian Mafia. It was always my impression that it was a warning to Garrison to clam up. If Garrison is to be believed, that is not true. The meaning of the message is unclear, but it seems evident that the defense attorney's enthusiasm declined after that encounter. So we have people threatening members of the court involved in things related to this case. It's very, very bizarre. We have sheriffs being thrown out of office, gag orders. This case is just really, really bizarre. And most of the documentaries and podcasts on this case do not touch upon any of this information. We have rumors of police officers skimming drug stops on I-44. It's really, really bizarre. Garrison was bailed out of the secure county jail and taken to a hotel for questioning. Is this protocol? The bond was insignificant. Nothing came of that. Garrison told me that he was left alone and he simply walked out of an unlocked door and went on to rape that college student. In our brief conversation, he owned up to that crime and with good behavior should be out in a relatively short time as his sentences run concurrently. I did not find him threatening and would invite him into my home to discuss the case if he wanted to meet. I just think he wants his freedom. He also said that the other two of the grand jury 3 played no part in this crime, and I believe him. It really doesn't make a lot of sense. All 3 had a long rap sheet, and they were easy targets for the prosecuting attorney as they were on the street at the time of the abductions. Having said all this, I personally believe the best suspects would be bad cops, Robert Cox, or my best take, someone who scoped out the girls at one of the graduating parties and simply followed them home. All right, so this is all very, very bizarre, but allegations of police corruption and intentional malfeasance or obstructions to this case being solved being thrown up from within law enforcement. How easy would that be to identify? So are there people in law enforcement that simply do not want this solved? Are there some kind of corruption connections between people pretty high up in the law enforcement or political food chain that prevented this case from being solved, at least thus far? So let's just touch upon quickly the RICO Act. So RICO, of course, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. So let's see some more involvement here. Here's an article from truecrimediary.com, very interesting. The Springfield Three, this was published September 27, 2007. The detective on the phone wanted to remain anonymous. Yes, he said, he'd worked on the case, but it had been a life-changing one, and the failure to solve it still plagued him like a dull ache. How did it change his life? Quote, not for the better, he said. The case was so perplexing that at one point a lead investigator allegedly threw up his hands and suggested maybe aliens were to blame. The detective cautioned against even writing about the story. He'd seen people, normal, logical people, become obsessed. Good advice, but it was too late. Graduation night, Stacy McCall and Susie Streeter had been childhood friends. By the time they entered Kickapoo High School in Springfield, Missouri, they'd drifted apart. And I mentioned this in previous podcasts as well. They started running with different crowds, things of that nature, but something brought them back together that graduation night. In pictures, Stacy looks preppy and hesitant. She planned to attend college and pledge a sorority. Susie, her hair bleached blonde, reportedly hung out with a rowdier crowd. She intended to follow in her hairdresser mother's footsteps and go to cosmetology school. The end of high school as a way of dissolving cliques and reuniting old friends, and by June 6, 92, the night of their graduation, Stacy and Susie were hanging out again. Graduation day had been filled with gowns and endless posing for cameras, but the night would be different. The girls had a plan. Along with another friend from childhood, Janelle Kirby, they would attend several parties. Later, they would drive an hour or so to a hotel in Branson close to the Whitewater amusement park they planned to visit the next morning. Stacy's parents weren't happy about the late-night drive. They were relieved when she called around 10:30 p.m. and said plans had changed. They'd decide to play it safe and stay overnight at Janelle's, leaving for the amusement park in the morning. So another interesting puzzle piece in the many moving pieces in this case. Did that change of plans? Who knew about it? Did someone urge them to change those plans? That seems to be a possibly relevant piece of the puzzle. Anytime you have things unplanned thrown in the mix that throw off an intended timeline, that's always something to look at. The three girls left their last graduation party close to 2 a.m. and headed back to Janelle's. But Janelle's family had relatives from out of town staying overnight, so plans changed again. Susie's mother had given her a king-sized waterbed as a graduation present, and Susie and Stacy agreed it would probably be more comfortable if they stayed at Susie's. No big deal. They would meet up with Janelle in the morning. Kathy Kirby, Janelle's mother, later said she heard Susie and Stacy talking outside near their cars. "Follow me to my house," Susie allegedly said to her friend. Okay, 1717, East Delmar. Susie lived with her mother, Cheryl Levitt, 47, in a modest house in central Springfield. Cheryl, an in-demand hairdresser at a local salon, was a single mother and especially close to her only daughter. They reportedly shared everything and had a loving relationship. Earlier in the evening, Cheryl had talked with a friend on the phone, telling her that Susie was away for the night and she planned to varnish some furniture and hang wallpaper in the home that she and her daughter had lived in for only 2 months. The friend said Cheryl sounded normal and never indicated anything was amiss. Now, here's another point. So Cheryl also believes that Susie would not be staying there. So, okay. The next morning, Janelle began calling Susie's house, 8 a.m., but her friends didn't pick up. Still sleeping, she thought. By noon, she decided to drive over to Susie's house with her boyfriend and see what was keeping them. So another interesting point. Now, people of all ages, of several different generations, have been discussing this online. If you're up all night drinking with friends, high school graduation night, how early are you getting up that morning? I mean, and different people have different answers. I'm not saying there's anything there, but I don't know. I really don't know. That's another point. Would they, if she's starting to call at 8, some accounts say 7:30 a.m., when did she wake up? Did she roll out of bed and call them? Why would you, even if she was up that early, I mean, how early were they supposed to go? Are they going to go that early? I mean, it seems strange that high school kids, again, even without drinking, even if it was a regular weekend, how early do typical high school kids get up on the weekend, even when they go to a water park? Do they really get up that early? I don't know. Just more points of contention and discussion. By noon, she decided to drive over Susie's house with her boyfriend and see what was keeping them. So that's a more realistic time frame. Okay. It was clear June morning. Temperatures would rise to nearly 80 degrees. Janelle got out of the car barefoot and approached the house. Something shimmering on the front steps caught her eye. Broken glass. The porch light was shattered, but the bulb still burned. Her boyfriend swept away the glass while Janelle tried to reach anyone inside. No one answered, but they had to be there, Janelle thought, noticing the 3 women's cars still parked in the driveway. She peered through the living room window. Neat, normal. Janelle and her boyfriend tentatively cracked open the front door. Cheryl's Yorkie Cinnamon lunged at her, barking and anxious. They walked to the rooms of the house, calling for their friends. A television was on. The 3 women's purses were piled on the steps of Susie's sunken bedroom. Janelle experienced the first flutters of concern when she noticed that Susie and Cheryl, both chain smokers, had left behind their cigarettes. Janelle and her boyfriend made calls. Hours passed. See, another point to the poster that theorized that there was something that has not been disclosed in the house, because if they're that worried right away with the cigarettes, whereas if there was also another note, forged or not, that was semi-plausible to explain their absence, I don't know. That could account for that, possibly. Hours passed. Stacy's worried parents came over. Her friends and relatives flooded the house, discussing what to do next. Eventually, the police arrived. In their report, police noted that a woman and 2 teenage girls were missing. Their purses had been left behind, along with their car keys and cars. It appeared that the girls had gotten ready for bed. Evidence of washed-off makeup was in the bathroom, and Stacy had folded her shorts and placed them on her shoes beside Susie's waterbed. The shorts worried Stacy's mother. Wherever Stacy is, her mother thought, she's in a t-shirt and underwear. There were no clear signs of a struggle or crime. The state of the house told an incomplete but troubling story. The porch globe had been broken. 2 slats in the window blinds had been separated as if someone was looking out. Panic swelled, but everyone tried to remain optimistic. A graduation cake left untouched in the refrigerator that said, "Congrats, Suze," was a reminder of the joyous celebration just a day before. Police left a small blue note on the front door. When you get in, please call and cancel the missing persons report. But Stacy, Susie, and Cheryl never came back. The missing persons report was never canceled. That was 15 years ago. Questions, but few answers. How do a woman and 2 teenage girls vanish from a house on a summer morning? No one knows, but it's not for lack of trying, says the detective. Quote, aspects of the case were mishandled maybe, but never out of indifference. Everyone worked their butts off to solve this, end quote. Over the years, the Springfield police have interviewed, dug, polygraph tested. Just about every verb associated with criminal investigation has been done, he said. One of the most enduring clues involves a suspicious van witnesses reported seeing near the Levitt home. Some said a dirty white van had been cruising the neighborhood in the weeks before the disappearance. Another said they saw a brown older model Dodge van near the home in the early morning hours of June 7th. The most intriguing van sighting was from a woman who said she was on her porch enjoying the sunrise when a moss green older model Dodge van pulled into the driveway next door. A young blonde woman who looked like Susie Streeter was at the wheel. The woman heard a man's voice say, "Don't do anything stupid." While some investigators feel strongly about the van reports, the detective said he was never completely comfortable with it. He couldn't put his finger on it, but finally said the invisible man's voice and what he said sounded too much like something from a movie. Listen, maybe it went down that way, he said. I just don't know. It's a common refrain in a case riddled with incomplete and contradictory evidence. One question leads yet to another with few answers. Every possible motive has major holes in it. For example, 1, it seems significant that Cheryl was supposed to be alone that night. But if Cheryl was the target, why not abduct her during the many hours when she was alone and not after the girls arrived? 2, if Cheryl wasn't the target and it was one or both of the girls, how does their stay at the house last minute and unplanned fit with that? 3, robbery isn't a likely motive. The house was located near much wealthier homes. A significant amount of cash was left in Cheryl's purse. And wouldn't 3 cars have deterred a potential intruder? 4, Cheryl was security conscious. There was no sign of forced entry. That suggests a suspect whom at least one of the women trusted and knew. But personally motivated crimes normally involve one perpetrator. Could one person have restrained 3 women, abducting them without leaving behind a single hair fiber or fingerprint? Many people believe they know one man who could. Suspect. He claims he sat in his truck and watched the Springfield police process the crime scene. Quote, why watch it on television when you can watch it in person? End quote. He allegedly said. If it's true, the man who would one day become the prime suspect was, in the early days, following the case from across the street. Robert Craig Cox's history of violence officially begins in 1978. Back then, he was a 19-year-old Army Ranger on vacation in Central Florida with his parents. On the night of December 30th, Cox returned to his hotel room bleeding from the mouth. He was missing an inch of his tongue. Emergency surgery was required to repair the tongue. Cox claimed he'd been in a fight and bit it himself. Hospital staff thought it was more consistent with someone else having bitten it. 5 days later, the badly beaten body of Sharon Zellers, 19, was found in a sewer next to Cox's motel. She disappeared the night of December 30th while driving home from her job at Disney World. Police let Cox go for lack of evidence. He went on to win a Soldier of the Year award. Then in 1985, Cox was suspected of 2 separate abduction attempts of young women in or near their cars in California. He pled guilty and received a 9-year prison term. In the meantime, prosecutors in Florida had amassed evidence against him in the Zellers case. They arrested him while he was in prison and brought him to Florida to stand trial. He was convicted and sentenced to death. But in 1989, the Florida Supreme Court ruled that at best the evidence created only a suspicion of guilt, and Cox was acquitted and released. Cox returned to California to serve out the rest of his sentence, was paroled, and returned to live with his parents back in his hometown, Springfield, Missouri. Kathy Baird is one of a group of determined people who are using the internet to try and solve the mystery of the missing Springfield women. She maintains a MySpace page about the case. She says she's been criticized and labeled a quack, but she doesn't care. The story haunts her, and she's determined to give it an ending. Sometimes her voice breaks when she talks about the missing women. Kathy believes Cox is a prime suspect. She's communicated with him and says that when he was asked how such a crime could be carried out, Cox answered, quote, if I were going to do it, I'd knock on the door and say there was a utility emergency, end quote. Which actually brings me to the next point. What if that part was real, and if he was posing as a gas leak, like there was a note that was found, again, all of these missing pieces, and possibly contradictory pieces of evidence that we don't know if is even related to this case. Let's say if he did knock on the door posing as a gas man, say there's a leak in this corner of the block, you guys need to go stay at a hotel, just leave a quick note just in case anybody comes. What if they did write the note, there was a gas leak, but then why would people still be coming and going inside the house? Wouldn't that be dangerous? They'd probably call the gas. Would they call the gas company? Would they stand outside? Would they go inside the house and look around? Or if it wasn't a gas leak, I mean, it's just strange. If they left a note that said they would stay at a hotel overnight, they'd be back at some point during the day. Who knows? But that's an interesting theory that was floated. Okay, anyway, in the summer of '92, Cox worked as a utility locator. in South Central Springfield. At first, Cox appeared to have an airtight alibi. His girlfriend confirmed that he was at church with her the morning the women disappeared. But then in '95, Cox was arrested for holding a gun on a 12-year-old girl during a robbery in Texas. Springfield police interviewed him again about the missing women. Cox implied, teased, suggested, but never confessed. His ex-girlfriend eventually recanted. Cox had asked her to lie for him. She testified to a grand jury. You know what else is interesting? With a guy like this guy, this criminal, known criminal, he could have been off doing other crimes or drugs or whatever and lied about it. And she covered for him, and he really was doing something else shady, but not abducting these women. I mean, who knows? But Springfield police never gathered enough evidence for an indictment. Cox, as though reading from a bad horror movie script, continued to play with detectives from his jail cell in Texas. He hinted he knew the women were dead and that they are buried somewhere near Springfield. Kathy Baird doesn't think he's bluffing. She says that on the morning Cox was to be sentenced for his Texas conviction, he slit his wrist in a suicide attempt. A Texas Ranger later told Kathy that Cox had said, quote, "As long as I'm in prison, murders like what happened to those women in Missouri won't happen again," end quote. Incomplete puzzle. There are other suspects, like local businessman Gerald Carnahan, who was recently arrested for the '85 murder of a young woman named Jackie Johns, and others, men on the periphery of the missing women's lives who possibly caused trouble there. But like everything else in the case, suspicions are murky and half-formed at best. Those close to the case are left with what they know for sure, which is very little. Certain details of the case call out to people. For Kathy Baird, it's Cheryl's house. How far back from the road it is, how dark and out of the way. "You wouldn't know it was there," she said. "This was no random opportunity hit." For the detective, it's in the interviews he conducted. At some point, it struck him that not one of the people he interviewed could keep something quiet for 15 minutes, let alone 15 years. He's inclined to think one man is to blame. The detective recalls how, trying to fall asleep late at night, he'd go over the scene at Cheryl Levitt's house in his mind over and over. He'd imagine the girls parking their cars, walking into the house, Stacy carefully folding her shorts as they got ready for bed. He always hoped he'd have a breakthrough and a scenario of the abduction that made sense to him. His mind always went blank. "Well, stranger things have happened," someone once said to the detective in a half-hearted attempt to comfort him about the case. "No," the detective said, "they haven't." So that was just an interesting write-up from an anonymous detective in the case. But, as I just mentioned with the RICO Act, it was reported that the Ozark Organization Crime Task Force was part of the initial investigation, as stated in the Springfield News Leader shortly after the crime occurred. The question is, why were they involved? You'd think there had to have been something there that drew them into the investigation. Again, the RICO Act, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. They were part of the initial investigation. Does that mean there was a POI or suspect that was linked to something or someone that encompassed the RICO Act's jurisdiction, so to speak, or investigation or case? So an FBI opinion on the case, an FBI violent crime specialist theorized that the three missing women were abducted by someone at least one of them trusted, and the abductor probably had help from one or more others. So this is a statement from Wright. The abduction leader was probably an acquaintance who, quote, "may have known their comings and goings," end quote. Secondary players may fear going to the police because they think the primary culprit would retaliate, he said. But anyone withholding information probably is feeling strong anxiety, he said. If you think you don't feel good about it now, don't think it's going to get any better. Don't think it's going to go away, Wright said. All right, let's look at Bart Streeter, Susie Streeter's brother, on his opinions on the performance of the Springfield Police Department. This is what he said. "Firstly, as many of you are aware, the SPD sent 2 detectives and over 10,000 documents to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to present this case in front of a 21-person panel of retired law enforcement, forensic professionals, ex-FBI, NCIC personnel, and others within law enforcement. This presentation took 2 days. That panel of professionals reviewed the information and compiled a report and sent that report to the Springfield Police Department. I believe part of that report was an overall assessment of the past performance of the Springfield Police Department in their handling of the case. I would like the SPD to honor my request to publicly release nothing that could be considered sensitive material or that could damage the ongoing investigation, just the overall assessment of their performance done by an independent outside agency. Okay, this National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. However, my request was denied, both by the SPD and the NCMEC, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The overall assessment needs to be made public. As I've said before, how can we, the people, make an informed, rational decision on the performance of the Springfield Police Department without that report? I believe that report would give us information needed to request and or demand FBI intervention in this case. Secondly, I rarely talk about the case. It is very painful and extremely frustrating. The last time I spoke with Springfield Police Department detectives was in 2012. At that time, Sergeant Alan Neal met me at my favorite restaurant for a tasty steak lunch. We spoke for about 4 hours. I found him to be professional, engaging, genuine, and limitedly informative. That meeting was the last time I spoke to anyone at Springfield Police Department. That would have been 7 years ago. I believe Sergeant Alan Neal retired in 2016. As such, we have reached one more sad milestone. He being the last detective who was working at the Springfield Police Department during the abductions and initial investigation. I have always been and continue to be available to anyone at the Springfield Police Department. Many years ago, when Chief Williams was hired, I became quite hopeful that he would be less political and more active in helping resolve our case. He made a pretty good first impression, and it's been all downhill since then. He talks about transparency, but that has not equated to any real transparency. His peacock presentation in politics will one day be rewarded with a gold watch paid for by the people of Springfield. Our feelings for one another are mutual. As most people may understand, as far as I'm concerned, the SPD had one job: find out what happened to my family and Stacy. They have been unsuccessful for over 27 years. It is well past time for transparency and public evaluation of their failure. So here's the thing. Is the reason they have not released this material regarding the SPD's performance because of something related to the RICO Act? Is the FBI or other law enforcement agencies, are they after bigger fish? And that's why they have no interest in solving the Springfield Three case at this time. They want to solve something bigger, whether it's regard to drug trafficking, law enforcement corruption, upper level corruption. I mean, we have gag orders in place here. What is going on? Would the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children comply with FBI or some other interstate or high-up agency in not releasing this report because something in this report could possibly link either a police chief or some member of the investigation to other law enforcement corruption, particularly the Galloping Goose Motorcycle Club? Does all of this intersect? Other thoughts from Bart Streeter are this: I consider the investigation a failure, not bungled. Detective Neal and I have had our differences, but I always felt that I could rely on him for the truth because of his personal ethics and professionalism. Try to understand that within the first few months, my contact detective was Asher. I trusted the man, believed wholeheartedly that he would be the one to solve this case and bring my family and Stacy back. Yet upon the airing of the 48 Hours episode in September 92, it became painfully apparent that I had placed my trust in the wrong person. To this day, I do not understand his agenda, an agenda he once again sadly attempted on the PI show, but with much less skill. His manipulative outright lies are glaringly obvious. Gotta give him credit for follow-through. He still tries to make my family look less than, and the new twist of making me a violent villain played well. He sees Stacy and the McCalls as the only true victims. Since the beginning, he has shown deep empathy for the McCalls. He is quite talented. He maneuvered himself into an advisory role within their family while on active duty and after he retired. He is quite close to the McCall family. There have been 5 TV shows that have been done on the case. Asher is in every one of them and has had a profound effect on the narrative. The last 2 shows, Crime Watch Daily and People Investigates, contacted me and asked me to participate. After much thought and counsel with my daughter, we declined. 27 years is a long time, and tabloid TV is not going to help us, but it will put a lot of money in network pockets. I also find reenactment shows to be highly speculative, sensationalist, irresponsible, inaccurate, and distasteful. And it's hard to argue with Bart Streeter on those points. So, yeah, there's definitely some really, really hard questions that need to be asked regarding the investigation of this case. Does the RICO Act play a part? Is there truly law enforcement corruption that intersects with a galloping goose? Some of whose members have supplied crypt vandals and other tertiary characters in this case with drugs and other connections. And of course, let's not forget all of the shady characters that were supposedly casing the neighborhood and even attempting to break into certain houses. Again, if you haven't checked out the previous podcast episode, Suspect City, check that out. There's a long list of shady individuals in that area in the days in question and even the week or 2 leading up to that abduction. This is just because this happened on graduation night. I mean, there's so many different circles of suspects. And we've gone over them on the previous episodes, the first couple episodes as well. This is truly a bizarre and unsettling case. And there are even more details to go over. And I will continue covering the Springfield 3 case and going over all of these details. Please share this podcast series on social media and keep the awareness going in this case. I mean, there have been other cold cases that have been solved after long periods of time, so it's not impossible. As always, if you like and appreciate the podcast, feel free to donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. And any questions, comments, thoughts, theories, debunkings, rebuttals, thoughts of any kind, leave them in the comment section. And you can check us out, Twitter, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case, topic, podcaster requests. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.